As a screenwriter, there are a lot of elements of this story that I had to Beth and I had to actively fight dramatizing because it is very, very, the board game Clue. It's every suspect, to your point, Jim, you hear their potential involvement, you say, that must have been what happened. Until the next episode when you go, actually, wait, that must have been what happened. And this case never got any less interesting over the years, literal years that we were investigating it. We kept till the very end, to the release of the final show, we were finding things that would kind of turn things around for us. So it's not just the listener being sort of like, we weren't like keeping red herrings and not giving you information. Even we were kind of shocked by what we would find out week to week until the final release. I think, everyone knows this term of like Occam's razor, like what the most likely scenario is probably what it was. So we begin the story with the person closest to Helen. We begin with the houseman who not lives there, but he's there in her home, right? And then we do concentric circles out from there. And what's interesting is, as wide as you can get out in those circles, there is a way that all these people could or could not be connected. So again, you have this idea of, is there a conspiracy here? Or is it a conspiracy of unwitting? Or is it ultimately not a conspiracy at all, but is the conspiracy a product of, again, this popular desire to kind of find a conspiracy when there's no answers after a certain number of years. I think that happens in a lot of cases. And you've mentioned the Savannah Guthrie's mother, that case, that's been on my mind a lot as I've been producing this show. It happened right while we were in post-production. And it's been very, very, in a way, difficult to watch because I'm looking at it 50 years down the line. And I'm hoping that Savannah Guthrie's mother's case resolves, before it gets to the point where someone has to come in 50 years later and wonder what really happened.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight on Cold Red, we examine one of the most fascinating and mysterious disappearances in American history, the case of Candy Harris Helen Brock. 1977, one of the wealthiest women in Chicago vanished without a trace after becoming entangled in the dark side of the elite horse industry. What followed was a maze of fraud, deception, organized crime rumors, and unanswered questions that have haunted investigators for nearly 50 years. Who is Helen Brock really? Was she a lonely widow manipulated by predators, or did she uncover something dangerous before she disappeared? Joining us tonight is Jonathan Rocks, co-host of the podcast, What Happened to the Candy Harris? As we dig into the victimology, the suspects, the behavioral patterns, and the theories behind one of America's most enduring cold cases. This is Cold Red. I'm Ray Carr, and with me always is Jim Fitzgerald. Jim, how are you tonight?
I'm fine, Ray and John. Welcome to Cold Red to
Thank you
discuss this case. Screenwriter who's done a lot of work over the years, different awards he's won, and we're also personal friends. We're all three of us members of the VDoc Society. But if we could have been talking about Nancy Guthrie, Ray. I mean, not 50 years ago, of course, but I think it's 100 days this week, maybe even today, that she's been missing. But this case certainly predates her by a few decades. And we're going to dive into this case of a woman who has a massive wealth. It's a high society disappearance and a trail that went cold that 50 years ago. And we're talking about the candy heiress, Helen Brock.
To understand what happened with Helen on that day in 1977, we got to understand who she was. And John's going to help us with that. We need to build a comprehensive victimology profile to see the world through her eyes, or the eyes whoever may have been watching her, Jim.
Yeah, and to do that, we brought in John Rocks, who has lived and breathed this case for a number of years. That I happen to know. He is the co-host, along with Beth McNamara, of the podcast, What Happened to the Candy Heiress? So again, John, welcome to Cold Red.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I do want to clarify, it's The Missing Candy Heiress, the title, just in case anyone's searching for it. It would just be The Missing Candy Heiress. No worries. Yeah, I'm glad to be here. This is actually my first foray into speaking about the case. We were on such a breakneck pace producing and distributing the podcast that I'm glad to be here to talk about it.
Well, let's start at the beginning. When we talk about, and people hear that terminology, heiress, they think of gates and they think of guards and isolation. But your research is a little bit different. So who was Helen Brock?
So Helen Brock was born not wealthy, let's say. She was born in Ohio in the early 90s. She married into the Brock money. She met Frank Brock just about when she was 40 years old, almost about 39 years old. He was quite a bit older about 19 years older than her. And so it wasn't that she was born into the money. She was left the money after her husband died. So there's this sort of disparity between the way she came up and the way she lived as an older adult, which was quite different. Born in the rural countryside of Ohio, she didn't have all that much. But by the time she, was Helen Brock as we know her today, she was one of the wealthiest women, especially after her husband passed, one of the wealthiest women in the country. Her money today would be somewhere around $130 million. I mean, it would be quite a fortune.
And let me just clarify for everyone, if the Brock Candy Company is still out there, and if you see the little hearts every Valentine's Day with a little I love you and be my Valentine, whatever, that's the Brock Candy Company that is still out there and fully functioning. And I'm sure all the folks out there have bought or eaten at one time. And this is the woman who basically inherited that company. And almost 50 years ago, she goes missing. And that's what this investigative podcast is all about. And John, I know you've spent a lot of time with this and putting this whole thing together. I've listened to it, folks. It's an excellent investigative podcast. Each episode's a little bit different, but the production quality is great. I like John. You're a great narrator and host. Again, few people know the case better than you. And Beth, of course, is part of it, who couldn't join us tonight. So really a well-done enterprise, and suggest to everyone. It's on Spotify and
yes,
everywhere else that you can get it. So we always like to look for the concept of victimology, and we're looking through the vulnerabilities, the routines, red flags that some offender would look at her and choose to exploit her. I mean, I guess give us a little more of her lifestyle back then. With where did she live? With whom was she associating? The whole horse connection to it, and just kind of paint that picture for our audience.
So she went missing in 1977, February 1977, to be exact. She had been away out of town at the Mayo Clinic to get about a week-long battery of tests. Nothing serious, but just kind of a checkup, let's say. According to her houseman, her butler, she returned home and then left that weekend in February to go to Florida and was never seen again. Now, prior to that, what's interesting is she's not from Chicago. She lived in Glenview, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago. She wasn't from there, so she didn't have a real, social standing in the area. She didn't have that many people that she was involved with. So I would hesitate to say she was living sort of like a hermit's lifestyle. Not at all, but she really didn't involve herself with all that many people in the area. So she wasn't kind of out in the public, going to events and things like that to build a high profile. She was kind of kept to herself, which is what's so interesting about the case, because there's not that many people who were close enough to her in those final days and final weeks and years that it would open up the door to that many people could have maybe been responsible for it. It only leaves us with, as you heard on the show, maybe 3 or 4 potential suspects, let's say.
What were some of her daily habits and routines, if she had any?
Well, interestingly, she was a habitual diarist. She kept a diary of not always seemingly consequential things. She would keep track of her weight. She would keep track of what she ate, how she felt, doctor visits, things like that. But interestingly, that habit plays a part in the story because this collection of diaries that she had over the years, which especially leading up to her disappearance may have told us something about what happened, were destroyed right after she had been found missing, or I should say reported missing. Those diaries were destroyed supposedly at her request. As I had mentioned, her houseman, it's essentially her butler, said that she had once told him if anything happened to her, he should immediately destroy her diaries. And that just so happens to make it very difficult to know what was happening in the days and weeks leading up. But she was someone that traveled. She would leave Chicago and go to Florida, and she spent time in Fort Lauderdale. She would travel home to Ohio. She would travel usually with family. She had a few friends, not too many that she would travel with, but she was kind of, as most of us would be when you have $100 million, I should say, you can kind of do what you want. And that's essentially the life she lived. She could go where she wanted, when she wanted.
With that type of money, did she have security measures in place or personal protection?
Well, as I had mentioned, she did have a houseman who she had inherited from her husband. Her husband had hired this guy's name is Jack Matlick, and he had operated as whatever Frank Brock needed him to be, he would be. He would be a driver, he would do security, he would do, fix up stuff around the house, things like that. So she inherited him as sort of, the way I put it in some of the writing was, he had taken on some of the husbandly duties, meaning like fixing things around the house, driving her, fixing the cars, like all of the things that she didn't want to do for herself, he would do. But in terms of security, that was about the extent of it.
And we should add too that she was married at 40, and that was the first time she married, and no children.
Well, interesting. One of the things that we discovered in the research, what you'll find out And anyone that's ever looked into the Brock case, there's not all that much out there about her. One of the main things that Beth and I were really interested in doing was centering Helen Brock, not the missing candy heiress, not, this fantasy story of this rich woman who went missing and no one knows. We wanted to look at the actual person at the center of the story, which for 50 years has not really been looked at. So I think that was one of the major things that we were interested in, which was looking at the person who went missing, not necessarily all of the accoutrement of her lifestyle that added into this fantasy of the cold case of the missing candy heiress. We use that title, the missing candy heiress, because that's how she's become known. But I think, Jim, as you said, as you listen to the show, you get to know her a lot more closely through this show because of how we approached it. One of the main things that I see as a differentiator in the way we told the story is we had the involvement of Helen's family. So for the first time in almost 50 years, her family is actually speaking and asking questions and telling her story in a much more deep way than has ever been told before. And I think that kind of gives another dimension to the victim here. Again, centering the victim is very important to us.
And Ray knows this, and we use this word a lot on Cold Red. And when we do media interviews, including with the Nancy Guthrie case, that is the concept of victimology. And I'm saying if you listen to this podcast, each of the episodes, everyone digs just a little bit deeper into just who was Helen Brock. And it's not just, she goes missing, we're looking for crime scene evidence. It's important. But to really solve a case anywhere like this, and I would argue also with Nancy Guthrie, a case, you have to know everything about them and the people surrounding them. And that's where by the second or third episode, you start bringing in other characters from her life, John, and each of them has an aura about them, including their horses, so to speak, that you're saying by the end of that episode, boy, I'll tell you what, that's a likely suspect. And then, of course, near the end, it kind of comes together for everyone. But it's a great weaving and twisting of the storytelling, and who knows if there was some kind of a Agatha Christie connection to this, where everyone had a little bit of a role, or at least knew what was happening. And that's kind of what at least I took from it. But I'll let you just pick up from there. And the horse mafia part is really interesting from in the Chicago area.
As a screenwriter, there are a lot of elements of this story that I had to Beth and I had to actively fight dramatizing, because it is very, very, the board game Clue. It's very, every suspect, to your point, Jim, you hear their potential involvement, you say, that must have been what happened, until the next episode when you go, actually, wait, that must have been what happened. And this case never got any less interesting over the years, literal years that we were investigating it. We kept till the very end, to the release of the final show, we were finding things that would kind of turn things around for us. So it's not just the listener being sort of like, we weren't like keeping red herrings and not giving you information. Even we were kind of shocked by what we would find out week to week until the final release. I think, everyone knows this term of like Occam's razor, like what the most likely scenario is probably what it was. So we begin the story with the person closest to Helen. We begin with the houseman who not lives there, but he's there in her home, right? And then we do concentric circles out from there. And what's interesting is, as wide as you can get out in those circles, there is a way that all these people could or could not be connected. So again, you have this idea of, is there a conspiracy here? Or is it a conspiracy of unwitting? Or is it ultimately not a conspiracy at all, but is the conspiracy a product of, again, this popular desire to kind of find a conspiracy when there's no answers after a certain number of years? I think that happens in a lot of cases. And you've mentioned the Savannah Guthrie's mother, that case, that's been on my mind a lot as I've been producing this show. It happened right while we were in post-production. And it's been very, very, in a way, difficult to watch, because I'm looking at it 50 years down the line. And I'm hoping that Savannah Guthrie's mother's case resolves, before it gets to the point where someone has to come in 50 years later and wonder what really happened.
Jim kind of did a segue into this equestrian connection here and some of the financial exploitations that was going on during that time. But, how did Helen even become involved in, I'm sure our audience would like to know, how did she become involved in the horse industry?
Well, when she was with Frank Brock, he had owned horses, right? It was a kind of a hobby of theirs. They would fly down to Florida and they would race their horses. She was a big time animal lover, which I am as well. So that kind of drew me to her. And what happened is, after, I guess, several years after her husband passed, she decided to get back into it. She had met a man named Richard Bailey, who is yet another likely suspect in the story. And one of the things that, of many jobs he had, one of the things he did was sell horses. So she had enough money. She got, back into the horse industry through him. What ended up happening was, and this is again where you're pulled in as a creative writer, as a screenwriter, there's something called the horse mafia, which existed in suburban Chicago. It was relative to the mob in Chicago, but far enough into the rural areas that they didn't really cross paths that much, but they were led by a guy named Silas Jane. Familiar with Chicago has probably heard the name Silas Jane. He was a very kind of a scary character, but he sort of had the grip on this area, the suburban Chicago horse world that she became a part of. And again, it's so full of character and so full of danger and all of the typical mob type things that you hear about in stories that I think that she genuinely was involved in that world. But whether or not that played a part in what ended up happening to her, it's up to, the listener to kind of decide which version of what may have happened they lean toward. But the horse mafia was not a fun group to be involved with, let's say.
You talk about that horse mafia. I know our audience would love to know 1970s. What's the culture like then?
Well, a lot of times when you hear this is a Chicago, a cold case out of Chicago, you think the city. But if you look into this case in particular, the suburbs in Chicago in the 70s, it was pretty rural, especially out on these farms where this was happening. So it's, the way I put it is, it's a little closer to, what's the show, Yellowstone, like that kind of vibe, a little closer to that type of character. Silas James is this tall, strong guy who kind of looked like a cowboy, which is, not what you expect when you hear a Chicago mob story, which is why I think this moniker of the horse mafia really caught on. I mean, it's a pretty catchy way to describe a group, but it's essentially what they were. They would do things like buy a horse, insure that horse, and have someone come in and kill that horse so they could then get the insurance money for it. They would also burn down competitors' stables and things like this. So it's not the typical mafia type hits that you would imagine. Those were a part of this, but more likely than not, it was insurance fraud, was arson is a huge, huge part of this, and things like that.
I don't want to give too much away. There's also an exploding car.
This is true.
Which is shades of, traditional mafia. I'll just put this out to our audience. I think we know our audience pretty well. You will thoroughly enjoy this podcast. But if nothing else, if you either own a horse, you want to buy a horse, or you have friends involved in it, listen to some of the middle episodes there. You're going to learn a lot about how that business works. And I have a feeling it's not all that different today, especially with Robert Bailey, who was, in his early 90s when you were interviewing him?
Yes, 93.
And what a character this guy is. They had some very clear, crisp interviews with him, and he was actually hitting on Beth over the phone because he was, silver tongue? What did he call himself?
He called himself the Golden Tongue.
There you go.
Because he was actually given that name during the trial because of his way with words, especially with women. And I'll tell you, yes, he was hitting on Beth, and he did not want to hear from me because he thought I was Beth's husband or boyfriend or something. So he didn't want me to be a part of those conversations, but I was listening in, let's say.
Well, and Ray knows, like any good interview technique, if the bad guy starts wanting to talk to your partner, and if it happens to be a female, just back off, stay silent, and sometimes they can get a lot of information in that regard. So, and I heard some of the interviews that you played for me even offline, and that you guys were conducting, and you, for not being I know your family is law enforcement, but for not being law enforcement yourself, you and Beth really did a great job there. Yeah, very impressive.
Yeah, she and we made very good partners in that way. We have different strengths and different weaknesses, each of us, and I think that's a perfect example. We have more interviews with Richard Bailey than I think anyone has ever had. He's now, spoiler, he's now passed. He was 94. He did tell us at 93, we asked him about how many years he thought he had left, and he said about 35. So he thought he was going to live to be about 128, but he did pass, but we wouldn't have those. And that's, to your point, Jim, that's the really important thing about a partnership here, whether it's law enforcement or production. Where we were getting further with Richard was Beth speaking to him. So you're exactly right. You back away and you let that conversation happen. And it resulted in some of the most compelling interviews that we got, I believe.
And again, I don't want to do too many spoilers here, but he did some jail time over this case, yet it still doesn't mean 100% his exact role. And it's complicated, but you explain it well. And I think it's a very solid conclusion in the final episode. But there are just so many characters that come in and out of this. And Richard, and I said Robert, I meant Richard Bailey. He was actually like kind of a boyfriend, maybe fiance, but I know that goes back and forth.
Yeah, he would claim that they were in love and they were planning to get married and all of that. If anyone would have found evidence of that, it would have been Beth and I. He did have a relationship, so to speak, with Helen, in that they would go to events together. He was a wonderful dancer, apparently. He was a dance instructor at one point. And she was a big fan of going out dancing. So they would go and do things like that. I personally don't believe they had anything beyond that relationship-wise, but they definitely did. They were involved with one another's lives. So again, it makes sense why he was viewed as someone that was potentially, maybe to blame or in the mix. And again, whether or not you still think exactly what his part is what it is after the show, I'm not so sure. The one thing I want to say about this is even Beth and I have differences of what we ultimately think happened, like we've come to the same conclusion in terms of ultimately who's to blame, but how it, spun out from there. That's one of the interesting things about this case, because it does seem to be up for debate, like what happened after, the event that cost Helen her life or made her go missing. What happened after that is kind of that's the moving pieces part of this story, which really kind of serves as, and one of the things that we've kept in mind is very cinematic. This story, it feels like a movie because of the characters. We tried to keep it from feeling like we were pitching it as such, but I mean, the characters do not get better than the characters we found within the story. They're very, very interesting people, not very good people, but the stories are just unbelievable. And I want to mention the way that I got brought into the Brock story was I'd been hired to write an adaptation of a novel by Gene O'Shea called Unbridled Rage. And it was about Silas Jane, the horse mafia. And ultimately, it was about the oldest cold case in the history of Chicago that was ever solved. It was the Peterson-Schuessler murders in 1955. So within that book, which I would recommend to everybody to read, it's a very compelling book, very, very well written by Gene. Within that, there's a small section about the Helen Brock case and the car blowing up and the horse murders and all of that stuff. That's where I got brought into the Helen Brock story. And then it spun out from there. And I think it was during the pandemic, Beth and I really just became kind of obsessed with it for a while.
You've mentioned twice Silas Jane. Who is he really? And what's his involvement in this, if you care to say?
So Silas Jane was essentially the mob boss of rural Chicago. The way I've had it put to me, there's a guy named Red Wimet, who was an FBI informant for years in Chicago. He described him as he was a guy that was dangerous enough that the Chicago mob said, you go out in the horse farms and we'll leave you alone if you leave us alone. He was that kind of psychopath, if you want to use that word. One of the things that I will say is he's probably most well known because he had a blood feud with his own brother, which resulted in the murder of his brother. And that's probably what he's most famous for, infamous, I guess you should say. But he was, again, like a character out of something like a Yellowstone. Like he was really an archetypal villain. And for whatever reason, seemed to have the ability to operate freely in suburban Chicago for most of his life. So he's essentially a mob boss figure that had a grip on the suburban horse world in Chicago.
Is that the feel where this was going, that was organized crime elements involved here? Is that where it kind of goes or leads to?
Well, the prevailing belief for many years, and this is what we were sort of weighing and challenging with this whole investigation, was that this was the story as it's been told is Helen had discovered that some of the horses that she bought were not as good as they had been sold to her. They were sort of bum horses. And the belief was she told the people that, Richard Bailey and the guys in the horse mafia, I'm going to go to the attorney general and the governor, and I'm going to have them investigate you. And that's what caused ultimately her demise or her to go missing. We found, I believe part of that might be possible. I don't necessarily know if that's exactly how it played out. That's what the accepted story of what happened to Helen Brock has been for many years. I think it's in some ways simpler than that, and in some ways a little more in-depth than that. I think that's a very neat, almost like a movie version of what could have happened. But I think it's both, again, simpler and far more complex than that.
And John, you went to the local police who investigated it. Of course, the original investigators were I'm not sure if you talked to any original investigator. I think they were all definitely retired, if not deceased. But you definitely spoke with the current PD, and you did some interviews. I'm not sure you could record it, but you relay that meeting or those meetings very well. You had to file FOIA requests to get some of the documents. Just just walk us through a little bit of dealing with law enforcement. Trying to put myself and Ray in the shoes of you knocking on our door with a 50-year-old case and wanting some information. But boy, if I wanted this thing solved, I think I'd be saying, sure, kid, put it out there.
Right. Please say that again. I like that. I like hearing kid. Well, that first and foremost, I come from a law enforcement family. I have nothing but respect for the investigators and detectives. I've never been one to be critical. The way I look at it is the latitude of a department, especially a small department. They don't necessarily have the ability to look into these cases. So I approached it almost as citizen detective. I'm not law enforcement, but citizen detective who has the ability to look deeply into this stuff, wanting to sort of discuss, because like you said, Richard Bailey went to prison for conspiracy to have Helen Brock murdered. 27 years in prison. But the case isn't closed. Most people, a lot of the newspapers reported case closed. Richard Bailey did it. And when I asked, one of the very first things I did was directly call the police department in Glenview and say, I just wanted to find out, is this case open or closed? And as I told you, the answer I got was this case is open-ish. And I didn't know what that meant. So
neither do I.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, well, we sort of know what happened, but it's not officially closed. So I didn't believe, because it's an open case, I didn't believe anybody would speak to me about it. And I wasn't even certain FOIA requests would be honored because it's an open case, technically. We did get denied on our FOIA request, but when we went to the Attorney General, it was overturned and we did end up getting files. And I did go to the Glenview Police Department and meet with the deputy chief and the head of the cold case unit. We did not record. Weren't allowed to record, but we did have a meeting that was, in my estimation, productive, very productive. We also went during that same trip to Helen Brock's home, which the current owners, the Glavins, were very, very graceful and allowed us to go through the entire home, even in where we thought there might be some forensically valuable things to look at. And they remain open to the idea that if there is something of forensic value, they are open to having that looked at in any way necessary, which I didn't expect. If it's my home, I don't know that I would extend that, but they did. So, the case, we still, after 4 years, after interviewing the police department, after everything we've done, we still don't really know where the case stands. They say now that it's open, not open-ish, not closed, but they say it's open. But we would say if it's open, where do things stand? Especially without giving spoilers, especially with some of the things that we present by the end of the show. In our estimation, that would require, if it's an open case, that would require some movement on the department's side. As far as we know, that won't happen. But even something as simple as Helen's belongings are still held at Glenview's police department. So it's about 4 or 5 suitcases and a few items, a diary or 2, things like that. And her family do want those things back. So we asked if that would be a possibility. And we were told that it's not a possibility, but they're not going to be testing anything. But they would need to hold it for, we were told they can hold it for up to 99 years. I don't know, for what reason, but because I'm totally open. If they believe there's something forensically valuable, Beth and I are completely thrilled if they want to engage it, but I'm not certain that's going to happen.
Well, folks, if you're listening to this in 2075, contact that PD and saying John Rocks, Jim Fitz, and Ray Carr. So we want Helen Brock's possessions.
That's exactly right.
Hopefully they'll have no reason to keep it. And I know I shared some of the frustration with you because we talked about this over the last few years, even before you went to production. I was glad to at least, do a little bit, some advisory information there for you, but really you and Beth ran with it. But this is as a profiler, even as a linguist, I was just fascinated with some of the aspects of this, listening to the tapes, listening to the recordings that not everyone knew they were being recorded, and the other law enforcement folks involved. It's a mysterious case, but I can't think of too many cases with this many sort of tentacles to it that can be brought together like you did at the end. There's really just a few options at the end that, you really have to choose from. And at least one of them is very descriptive of what perhaps happened to Mrs. Brock. And we don't have to get into that.
Right.
It's interesting, too. We're not even sure if she ever made it back from the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, this flight that she was supposed to have. And people saw her in, a gift shop or something. But not on the aircraft itself, and it's but then people say she landed, they picked her up. So there's a lot there, and there's obviously some aforethought. There was pre-offense behavior, as Ray and I like to refer to, maybe not real sophisticated or drawn out, in all kinds of scientific ways, but somebody put some thought into doing this. And I guess maybe we can just sort of wind things up here a little bit. But of course, motivation would be important to determine. You've already mentioned back then she was a multimillionaire when well into the hundreds of millions nowadays with, adjusted for inflation.
Mm.
What would have been some motivating factors in to disappear her that they now use as a verb, disappear?
Well, if we're to go with the prevailing understanding of what the story is, the horse mafia, if they were being threatened, as I'd mentioned, I don't believe Silas Chain would have been concerned if someone was going to the governor or the attorney general. He just wasn't that kind of person. But if they were being threatened with, an investigation, perhaps that would be something, that would move them to have her disappeared. I also believe that, as I mentioned, she's not from Chicago, and I think she was winding down. And I know for a fact she was moving to Fort Lauderdale. And I believe she may have been closing up shop in Chicago, which would no longer necessitate having a houseman. So if all the opportunities therein were evaporating for someone like Jack Matlick, maybe that may have been something of a reason. And then, when it comes to someone like Richard Bailey, it could have been
90-year-old who used to kind of date her.
Yes, it could have been something there, but as I had mentioned, I don't believe they ever truly had a relationship in that way. So, I think that I have always been of the mind that it's some mixture of conspiratorial, not, as you said, not sort of predetermined conspiracy, but a conspiracy of opportunity for some of these people. And one of the things I want to mention is one of the early challenges to covering this story is that it's an old case that people have heard about. It's one of the most famous cold cases in American history. But what's interesting about the way we presented it is, as you've mentioned, Richard Bailey is interviewed extensively and speaks for himself. Helen's family is interviewed extensively and have the questions that they have. But we also have Jack Matlick's interrogation tapes, which no one has ever heard before. We've obviously not used all of them, but we have a huge amount of his interrogation tapes, which, Jim, as you know, as you listen to them, are even more, they spawn even more questions than the podcast allows because of how impossible it was to kind of keep his story straight over the years. And I think those sorts of exclusives, because one of the other things is we have a confidential informant who we have recordings of, as you mentioned, going into extreme detail about what he claims happened to Helen. And it becomes a question of which, if any of these variants of what may have happened, do you believe? Because they're all quite compelling. And none of them have been heard the way we're presenting them. So that's what I would say to the audience that's listening. If you've heard of the Brock case before and you've assumed what may have happened, this is a totally different look at the case. We did that very much on purpose. We kind of backed away and started from square one. And, I think what we've presented is as close as you would get to a full reinvestigation as possible.
Yeah. There's, and without giving too much away. And of course, at the very end, she did have a will, and we can wait till people hear maybe the last episode. The money didn't go exactly necessarily where her will said, which you have to always ask questions about that. And her money is still paying lots of people today. And again, they can hear that in the final episode. But she's still worth a lot 50 years after her no doubt demise. Exactly where she is and in what condition, you can listen and find and hear some of the options there, but or possibilities. But yeah, her money lives on, and certainly the interest of it. And you have to wonder, does that go back to a decision made almost 50 years ago where that money wound up? And not in a place you would necessarily think. And I'll just leave it at that for now.
John, I want to throw something back at you. And
sure.
In your research and in your investigation of this case, what do you see as some of the biggest mistakes that were made early on in the investigation?
Well, for a case that at almost 50 years out, it was always believed that there was no evidence. It's just simply not the truth. That's not the case. And that was one of the main things that, again, Jim will tell you this, I don't have an adversarial thought about the police or the investigators at all. But my question was, if this evidence had been found, why does no one know about it? There have been, again, in 50 years, there have been books and articles and podcasts, and a lot of people have looked at this case. Nobody found the evidence that we found. As a matter of fact, that was one of the most shocking moments of the entire thing, was when you come across something that lists evidence, like in a murder case, real evidence. I almost thought I was imagining it. And that was the big drama with the FOIA request, was whether or not that would be in the FOIA documentation. And it was. So it exists, and it existed. So that to me was one of the big, I hesitate to say mistake, because again, it's a small police department. It's the 70s. It's a wealthy area. They're not dealing with many murders or many disappearances. At the time, to give them a bit of grace, they were sort of saying, well, she could have just flown off. We don't know that she's missing just yet. But I think that allowed to extend a little too far, especially when you have a potential bad actor in that home, allowed to just exist there and clean things. To give some idea, the guy tore out the baseboards, painted the walls, cleaned the floors, had the cars detailed, removed rugs, did all of these things, and no one really seems to have questioned him for it. He forged checks, $15,000 worth of checks the weekend she went missing.
And burned her diaries. So, I mean, again, and if it sounds like I'm loading all of this potential guilt onto him, that's the first person we look at. So there's plenty of guilt to be spread around, but it's just all of those. My thing is those sorts of questions. Okay, if you have someone that forged a check, why are separate and apart from the Helen Brock disappearance, why is he not being charged with that immediately, let alone never charged at all?
And you're talking about Bailey, correct?
Matlick.
Okay.
And it was
about
Matlick. Those are the sorts of questions I have, which is, don't know what happened. I wasn't there. I don't have evidence or proof, but why are we certain it wasn't one person and it was the other person? Those are the sorts of questions I have, which is why were all the eggs put in one basket when it doesn't seem like there's enough to have that be the case.
I guess I'm trying to get a grasp of this. What did you and Beth do different that everybody else missed in the last 45, 46 years?
What's interesting is Beth and I have talked about this. I met her because she was investigating she lives in LA. I live in Philadelphia, and she was investigating the move encounter, the move bombing in 1985. I had done a decade's worth of research and interviews on that case. So she was put in touch with me. And what's interesting is when you have someone that is not from the area where a crime happened, a lot of times they don't know what questions not to ask. They don't know who not to speak to or who to speak to. They just want to find out what happened. And I think the difference with what Beth and I did was we approached this. I had never been to Chicago in my life before this case. I've been there a couple times now. We approached this completely clean of any preconceived notions. I had some idea who Silas Jane was, but everything else, I knew nothing. I didn't even know Helen had family remaining until I spoke to her nephew. And I said, I assumed she had no children and her brother had passed. I didn't know she had family still out there. So no one had ever made that outreach to them. And I think that was a big step forward in my confidence in telling this story, which is they deserve, if maybe not the true crime listeners and viewers or producers and writers like myself, but the family deserves to know what happened. And I think when we made it clear that we were positioning her as the victim and not just this cold case about the missing candy heirs, we're looking at Helen, the woman at the center of the case. That opened the door to the family. And I think through the family, we felt emboldened to then go forward in other ways that I'm going to tell you. Beth and I I'll give you one example. We found a piece of Brock personal history on eBay. It was a bench. Part of the write-up on eBay was that this person's mother had been gifted this small garden bench and they were selling it. It was like $80 or something. We got in contact with the person selling it and interviewed him. Anyone that had anything at all to say about any part of the case, we will go speak to them. I traveled through, I don't know how many states. I went anywhere and everywhere someone wanted to talk about this. And I think that's the difference. I wasn't on a deadline. Beth and I, we were working independently. Didn't have a preconceived thought of what may have happened or what may not have happened. So we were coming in completely free of all of that. And I think that's what changed our approach, which is having a different view.
Did you find, as in most cases like this, were witnesses reluctant to cooperate, or were people pretty much just sharing information? Was there anybody more reluctant than others in that? What you could find with that dated material?
There were a lot of people who were sort of saying, how did you find me? For instance, Jack Matlick's son, who was never a part of the story publicly, but we found something that connected him to, that we wanted to ask about. He was completely floored that we were able to find him and get in touch with him. So I think it wasn't a hesitance to speak to us, but it was like, oh my goodness. Beth found, I interviewed, but Beth found someone that had been married to Jack this is going to sound convoluted, Jack Matlick's third wife, her son's wife, right? But she spent months and years around Matlick, and we wanted to know what he was really like. She was floored, wondering how we got in touch with her. Well, I drove out to, I was almost in Pittsburgh, and like sort of the sticks near Pittsburgh, and interviewed her because we would go anywhere if we believed there's some piece of the story that hadn't been looked at yet. And again, that's not saying the police should have done that, because they can't. The reality is there's not the ability of a police department to do that, but we did. And that's why we wanted to kind of present and discuss what we had found, because perhaps it could shine a light on something that they had right in front of them, which I believe we kind of did.
That's just what the Bureau does. That's why the Bureau is so good, because we do things just like that. And Jim can attest to that as well. Doesn't matter where you're at. If we feel you have something that might add to it, we're going to come and talk to you.
You know what? I hadn't thought of it that way, but you're exactly right. Because you have the ability to kind of spend a lot of time just on that thing. And that's really the way we approached it. If there was something to be found or discussed, we were going to do it. And we found her car. She was known for having a car collection, and she had a purple Rolls Royce that sold at a Mecum auction in 2022 or 2023, sold for just under $100,000.
That's Jim's color.
Purple?
Yeah.
Hey, you should go look at the car. They're closing the place that it's at. Maybe they're selling it. But when a Mecum auction, a lot of times when it's purchased by a private owner, it's gone. It disappears. Well, we tracked it down and we traveled to a car collection and they let us in to see it. And we like things like that. Is there going to be evidence in that car? Not necessarily, but does it tell us something about Helen? Possibly. So we're going to go and see it. We also tracked her pink. She had a Pepto-Bismol pink Lincoln, gigantic car.
Color.
I knew it was coming.
That one is in Germany, believe it or not. And there's a guy on YouTube. This is what would happen. And maybe you can relate to this. It'd be 2 a.m. and I'm Googling Helen Brock car, location. And I find this guy speaking German, and he's standing in front of Helen's car and he owns it. Apparently there's a market for Lincolns, old Lincolns in Germany. And that's where her car ended up. So those are the sorts of things, that kind of differentiate. We weren't on a deadline for a book. We weren't on a deadline for a newspaper. We were kind of like, especially during the pandemic time, like we got nothing but time. So that may never happen again. Let's hope it never happens again. But that sort of time involvement may never happen again for Beth and I. So this was the one case where we really put everything on it.
John,
I have a question for you.
No, a real quick one, John.
Go ahead.
Then you, Ray. You did ask these 2 people with these 2 separate cars politely and respectfully, would you mind looking in the trunk for something for me?
You know what? With the purple one, we were able to look in the trunk. It was at a car collection in Chicago who didn't seem to know really why we were there. So we asked, can we open the door? And we opened everything in the car. We have photos, we have everything. So we were able to really get there and look at it. Gives you a different sense for what you're talking about when you're talking about the car. And we didn't even, in the pod, we didn't even really get into her cars that much. They were a big sort of, if you look at Mecum auction, Helen Brock, it's still up on the internet. They made a meal out of, because it was in Chicago where it sold. They made a meal out of the fact that this was Helen Brock's car. It was a big deal. So, those sorts of things, I don't anticipate that Glenview Police would have any reason or ability to do that, but we did. And that's ultimately what I think makes this treatment different.
Let me throw this. I have a question for Jim. Jim, you have a little bit of an advantage here. You've had a chance to listen to a few of the interviews, and I'm wondering.
To the interviews, actually.
Well, most of them. I'm wondering if you picked up any deception indicators in listening to those interviews.
Well, yeah, with a few of our earlier guests from this season, Joe Navarro, and of course, Jen from 2 weeks ago, Jen Thompson. Deception is difficult to detect even in person with someone without knowing a whole lot about them and not knowing the facts of the case. But I could definitely hear what you had the advantage of, and again, I'm not going to get too much into all the details here, but we had multiple interviews of Richard Bailey, and they were actually in real time. They were like just a few weeks old sometimes when I was listening to them. Then, of course, the Matlick ones were much older. And Bailey, to his credit, relatively consistent. A lot of braggadocio there, and Mr. Golden Tongue and whatever. Sorry I demoted you, Richard, to Silver Tongue. Rest in peace, Richard. But Matlick, you can definitely hear some stories changing over the years. And when he was confronted with certain things, I would say yes, arguably that's detection. I'm sorry, I detected deception, and that is something. If I was the investigator or even someone looking at these through, CCTV, whatever. During the break, I'd say to the investigator, all right, you got him caught up on this topic. This is something that bothers him. Go back and readdress that very specific topic of, 7 o'clock Tuesday afternoon, whatever it may have been. So, but yeah, there were definitely some of those factors there when I was listening. But of course, Madlik is long gone and there was no chance of re-interviewing them. But John, I think you picked up on some of those. I think you appreciated me pointing out a few of those factors that kicked in there.
I mean, I had no background or understanding of what you're even talking about until you kind of pointed it out to me. In some of the interviews, what you would highlight is a change in the tone of a voice where it would go higher or lower, the way a question was answered, the sing-song nature of a response, and like how that, it never dawned on me. Again, I'm not law enforcement, I'm not FBI. It never dawned on me, but yeah, that really does change the kind of geography of these interviews in a meaningful way, I think.
Yeah, I think even there's enough on these podcasts. I would welcome folks to, our audience to listen to it. They could pick up and say, well, that's from what the guests of this season have talked about so far. We mentioned, and of course, tonight itself, they could pick up, oh, yeah, there's an indication of a deception right there with this guy. So I think that would come across very clear. And yeah, we all think we can tell when other people are lying to us, whether it's your kids or your, a buddy at work or whatever it is. It's a little trickier in an interview room, as Ray knows, and these people can be really good at telling lies, but you give them enough room, enough time, including years in Madlik's case with different interviews, you can pick up on some inconsistencies, and that's where you hit them with it. And hopefully at that point, you can get them to break. But unfortunately, the interviewers didn't always go exactly in that direction, but that's so many years ago, and with a number of people being deceased now, not too much that could be done there.
And to be fair to the Glenview Police Department, the case quickly went from local police to ATF and FBI and beyond for many years. So like it wasn't as though it was solely in their grasp the whole time. But to what you're saying about the interviews with something, and this is where we came to the understanding that Bailey didn't have quite the relationship he was claiming he had. If you know anything about Helen Brock, she was obsessed with her dogs. They were like her children. She had the two dogs that we discussed, Candy and Sugar. She had buried in white caskets with satin inlays and buried with her family. Like she really, really cared about her dogs quite a bit. And then there was Beauty and Tinkerbell later in life. And when we interviewed Richard and he's telling us about all these exploits that he had with Helen, we said, well, what can you tell us about her dogs? And he goes, I don't know, what dogs? And to us, that was an indication of like, okay, that you would know about her dogs if you spent that much time with her. So again, it works multiple ways where sometimes someone's claiming they know something that they don't, or sometimes doesn't know something that you know. So it works in both ways in this case. It's really an interesting thing to listen to these interviews with the suspects.
I have to ask you, and I don't know if you can answer this question, but I'm going to ask you anyways, John, because I know our audience would like to know, but I don't know if you want them to render that from your podcast or if you want to give them a little teaser here. With all your research and investigation, what do you personally believe happened to Helen?
Well, I believe that she died at the hands of the most likely person. And this is where, for instance, Beth and I have a sort of a differing opinion. She's of the mind that it was a single person job through and through. And I believe it was sort of began as a single person job that turned into, I'm going to need help to get this cleaned up sort of thing. So, I mean, if you listen to the pod, we're pretty clear about where we come down on after someone is no longer with us, right? The actions that happen after that are secondary to the actual murder, right? So what caused Helen's death is something that we come to the conclusion of in the show. And it's based on new information, new evidence, and things that haven't been presented in this case in the media in 50 years.
Do you believe that someone is still alive today that knows the truth? And do you believe that a case like this can still be solved today?
I do think there are, or at least, I would say at least two people that if there's anything to be known, they know it, and I'll leave it at that. But I think that I'll go by what the Glenview police told us, which is this is an open case. If they keep this case open, that must mean they believe it could possibly be solved. Again, if you listen to the show, they believe that it is solved. Whether or not they ever move forward with that, I would wonder why not. If you have a famous and infamous cold case on your desk, and you have the ability to either investigate it further because you believe it could be solved, or move forward and solve it publicly, I wouldn't understand why you wouldn't do that. But yes, I do believe it could be solved.
And just to be clear, everyone suspects murder, but her body has never been found. So, and at the end of the podcast lays out what perhaps happened to her. We don't have to get into that, but let's just add this for sake of argument. If her body was ever found, of course, it would be remains and take DNA testing, et cetera, and other evidence to determine if it's her or not, dental records, whatever. But that could obviously open some doors to further investigation. And let's hope this podcast, meaning your podcast about the missing candy heiress, somehow that comes about and someone looks at a likely spot that they know some of these people from horse mafias or housemen or whatever, where they may have frequented. And let me check this spot one more time. And who knows what could be found.
Right. And if there's two things that Beth and I hope happen with this is, one, it sort of recenters Helen as a person, not just sort of a part of a story that's really mysterious. Recenters her as a real person that lived and had family and was murdered, and then also presents enough new information and questions that if you're listening, you should want to know why there hasn't been movement. You should want to know, why is this just a case that's never going to be solved for the next 50 years, like it hasn't been for the past 50 years, when there are avenues of investigation that are still out there that could be taken.
What do you hope listeners take away from your podcast, John?
Again, I would go back to that. I think there's different lanes of true crime, and sometimes the victim does get lost in the mix of the salaciousness and the sort of the conspiracy and the this could be a movie of it all. And what we want to kind of bring it back to, which is, Beth and I have worked a couple of cases together like this, always comes down to, this was someone's sister, this was someone's aunt, this is someone who was a 65-year-old woman. Beth, I won't give her age, but she goes, hey, I'm not all that far away from Helen's age. It could be me. And she always says, if this happened to me, I would hope there's an us out there making a pod. If no one's going to look into it, someone needs to. And I think that's the sort of thing. There's two things. If you've never heard about the Brock case, I would love for you to listen to this. And if you have heard about the Brock case and you think you know it, I would love for you to listen to this too, because I think there's still so much more to be known about this.
And I think that's a good sum of it. John, give us everything again, where it can be found, how, any Substack type of information.
We do have a Substack. If you just go to the missingcandyheiress.com, so it's just www.themissingcandyheiress.com. That'll bring you to a landing page that'll take you to our Apple, Spotify, iHeart, Audible, and our Substack. And our Substack has tons of extra content. Beth kind of really put on a show with if an episode talks about certain documents, we provide those documents for you to look at. If it talks about certain photos or videos, we provide those for you to look at. So after the episode, there's always more to look at our Substack.
Great. Ray, final words, and I'll take us out.
Yeah, John, this is fantastic. I've listened to I think two. I got to get back to listen to the rest of it. You've really piqued my interest, and I'm sure the interest of our audience. I can't wait to jump back on your podcast and listen to the whole range of your Substack there.
Excellent. Awesome.
Yeah, and folks, if you have an interest in, one more reference to the missing Nancy Guthrie, I think you'll find a lot of interest in this and what things have gone right and wrong 50 years ago, what things have gone right and wrong, today, maybe more wrongs than right, or at least not the break that police need there. So definitely some correlation there. John, thank you again for coming on Cold Red. And everyone out there, please follow us on our various social media and our blog, coldredpodcast.com. Like, subscribe, all the things you do to further our cause out there. And want to thank Matt McLaughlin, Matt Robinson, our producers, Rick Schilling, our music coordinator, and Ray, of course, thank you. John, thank you. Everybody, I'm Fitz, and we will see you next time on Cold Red.